So really understanding for us that human trafficking, it's not about a few bad apples. It's really, getting back to that sort of what motivated me in the first place. It's getting at that systemic issue. It's really understanding that it's our policy choices that don't protect workers. It's our immigration system that doesn't empower workers. It's our sort of racist, misogynistic history in our laws that put people into positions of
risk. Yeah.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Hidden Traffic. I am excited to have Gwen Bruggeman with me today. She is the executive director of the Freedom Network. Hi, Gwen. Thanks so much for being with us.
Hi, Gwen. So glad to be here.
So let's start out with a little bit about you, which is, where did life take you that you ended up being the executive director for this organization? How did you find kind of the passion to work on human trafficking? Tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. I started out a wide-eyed, hopeful young woman going to law
Don't we
school.
all? Yes, I know.
Yeah, right? It's the common story, Gwen. Really wanting to get engaged in civil rights work, human rights work, really sort of develop a real commitment and passion to doing some public interest work, wanting to go to law school, and really interested in the ways in which the law can both benefit people on the micro level, on the individual level, and also on the macro level, that like
kind
the
of
legal
policy level. Yeah.
The laws we adopt can dramatically help or hurt people. And so really was interested in sort of both levels of that. And so went to law school. While I was in law school, I was a student in a domestic violence clinic representing women in their protective order proceedings. And so ended up getting a fellowship, as most nonprofit lawyers do. We rarely get hired right out of law school with real money. So it took a fellowship at an immigrant rights organization in the DC area called Ayuda, with literally no understanding of the immigration system in the United States.
That's what you call learning on the fly, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. It was perhaps a bad decision for them, but worked out great for me.
I doubt it was a bad decision for them. But anyway, setting that aside.
And though speaking 0 foreign languages, I mean, I had a passing understanding of Spanish and a passing understanding of Japanese, incredibly unhelpful. But my fellowship there was to work with immigrant survivors of domestic violence. And there are, in our immigration system, we generally, the U.S. citizen holds all of the power. And so where there is domestic violence committed by a U.S. citizen against an immigrant spouse, sort of the traditional immigration system really hands a weapon to the abusive spouse, where they are able to use their immigration status and the power over their spouse's immigration status as another weapon in their arsenal in the ways in which they abuse and exploit their spouse. So there is now, under the Violence Against Women Act, one of the many wonderful things created under that law is an option for immigrant spouses to take the control away from their abuser, to apply for their own visa. And so that was my job, is to help those folks apply for legal immigration status independent of their abuser. And so that's what I did for about a year and a half. And then in the meantime, learned on the go, as you said, as quickly as possible, the immigration system, and really focusing on the humanitarian and family-based immigration system, how it works, why it works, how it doesn't work, and really learning about its sort of racist origins, really focused on supporting Europeans and white immigrants, and really trying to compensate over time to balance it a little bit, but really in fits and starts. And so then in 2020, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed. And as part of that legislation, modeled on the immigration protection for domestic violence survivors in VAWA, was this great new visa, the T visa, conveniently representing trafficking victims, the T visa, which was actually just the next letter in the alphabet soup of visas. But right, like kismet, how did that work out? But it did. The T was the next letter. So it became the T visa for trafficking victims, and that was passed. And then as working with the government, regulations can take forever. The U visa was created at the same time and took a very long time for the regulations to come out. But the T visa regulations actually came out pretty quickly. And I believe it was February of 2002 is when the regulations came out. And there happened to be, and the world works in mysterious ways, there happened to be a community-based organization in DC that also worked with domestic violence survivors. So I sort of had colleagues from the work that I was doing in that fellowship that was also working with a class of over 200 Vietnamese workers who had been rescued from a garment factory on the island of American Samoa.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was a garment factory that was exploiting the workers there. So as a sort of territory of the U.S., falls under the protection. Department of Justice investigated, brought the workers first to Hawaii. Then they moved across into mainland U.S. And the agency, this local agency called Boat People SOS in the DC area, was helping all of the workers to resettle, find spaces, coordinate their needs.
Find employment. Yeah. Okay.
All of that. Find food, find housing, find employment, all the things you need when you suddenly appear in Connecticut after expecting to spend 2 years in American Samoa and bringing home a bunch of money to Vietnam, and instead being beaten mercilessly and left to die. So quite a change of fate for those poor workers. And it was a very intense case. And then this T visa was created. So these 200 workers needed T visa applications, things that no one in the country knew about because it was just created.
Brand new.
Brand new. Yep. But as I said, based on the VAWA self-petition, what it's called, which is for domestic violence survivors, which is what I'd been doing for the past year and a half exclusively. So a colleague there said, hey, your fellowship's ending. Why don't you come over here and figure this out for these folks? And so that's what I did. And just learned from there, and then started to develop a program broader to ensure comprehensive social and legal services for these folks. And then to start expanding our understanding of trafficking, like who else is experiencing trafficking and who else can we and should we be helping and how can we do that? And that's also, frankly, when the Freedom Network started. So I was not the only one doing it. All across the country who were working with these cases, some bigger, some smaller, in different fields, but all at the sort of beginning of this new law was passed. These new protections were available. There was now funding for services a little bit, started out smaller amounts. And so the Freedom Network sort of was established to pull together these various providers and experts so that we could collaborate, share information, as we were figuring things out, as we were figuring out what is this application process? How do you do it? What's the next step? What works? What doesn't? And then sharing that information. And then finding, we just heard of a new survivor in Kentucky who can help them, right? At the time, in the early 2000s, it was a dozen organizations that were implementing the services and following this work and really getting engaged. So also just finding colleagues, convincing people, hey, this is a thing that exists and there's now stuff we can do about it. And they were like, what? No, that's just how immigrant workers are treated. There's nothing there. And so really just educating folks about what to do and how to do it. So that's how I started with Freedom Network. And then I ended up doing that work for a couple of years. And then I worked in language access for a couple of years. And then I ended up at the Department of Justice as a human trafficking fellow in the Office for Victims of Crime. So in the Department of Justice, the Office of Justice Programs administers all the grant funding, and the Office for Victims of Crime specifically administers funds for crime
human
victim
trafficking.
service.
Okay.
So human trafficking, and then under VOCA, other for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, all sorts of crime. There's a pool of funding that they administer, but also specifically the trafficking victims funding. So I spent about 3 years there as a human trafficking fellow, really helping federal agencies to understand the needs of service providers, the needs of victims, and how to better collaborate and coordinate their work, better policies and procedures to improve their response. And that was fascinating because I was there in the room with all the federal agencies, but I myself was not a federal employee. I was not a government employee. It was a grant to me as an individual. So I was sort of there, but not there. I was part of it, but not officially.
Well, you got to come in as the outside expert, which, I mean, is a unique position to have with government agencies. So
it was fascinating. And I got to learn how it works without but still being a little bit of an outsider. So not feeling responsible for it, but be more critical of it. Yeah, it was a fascinating time. So did that and then came here as the executive director for Freedom Network USA. And so, now I engage in the policy work. We've grown. Our membership now is over 80. We've got survivors who are individual members. We have organizations who provide legal and social services. We have academics and researchers who work on human trafficking issues, all of whom address this issue from a human rights-based approach. So really understanding for us that human trafficking, it's not about a few bad apples. It's really, getting back to that sort of what motivated me in the first place. It's getting at that systemic issue. It's really understanding that it's our policy choices that don't protect workers. It's our immigration system that doesn't empower workers. It's our sort of racist, misogynistic history in our laws that put people into positions of
risk. Yeah. Of being victimized. Yeah. I love that your organization is taking the kind of human rights focus and is very victim focused, because I've talked with some other organizations that are very focused on advocacy or are very focused on kind of lobbying of regulators to change laws, but many of them seem to miss that sort of the human rights aspect of actually providing services to victims. So I'm glad to know that you and the network exist and that you're working on that here. That raises a question for me, though, that I want to share with you, because I hear it all the time from people, which is human trafficking. Oh, as you mentioned, Vietnam. Oh, that happens over there. That happens in Malaysia. Or, oh, I heard that one case in Bangladesh. Yeah, that's not our problem. And I know, and I think more people need to know that that's not true and that it's a huge problem right here in the U.S. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the people that you are supporting and helping through the network and what human trafficking looks like in the United States?
Yeah, it's quite pervasive, unfortunately, Gwen. You're right. I mean, a lot of people, there are these big stories of these factories, and, we hear a lot about like in China and the abuse of the Uyghurs and organ trafficking in other countries. So it does look different in the United States, for sure, in many cases, sometimes the same, but sometimes quite different. So, one of the cases that really motivated the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act to include labor trafficking was the Monte case in California. So that was a sweatshop in Los Angeles that was producing garments in horrendous conditions where, similar to those cases you hear about in other countries, the workers were locked in. They were not able to leave during the day. They were not provided with breaks. They were not provided with food and drink. They were not allowed to leave during the day. There were locks on the doors to keep them in. So that happens in the United States. There was just actually this week, the EEOC had a webinar on the different types of investigations of trafficking cases that they've done. There was the Henry's Turkeys case, which was a case, U.S. citizens primarily with cognitive disabilities who were being hired out as part of their sort of rehabilitation program to work in poultry farms and a poultry farm. And they provided substandard housing. And for years, these men lived in terrible conditions, processing poultry.
No protections and
with very little healthcare, with very little access to services, with very little protective equipment. So we've seen there was a big case of agriculture where workers were being recruited to work in agriculture. U.S. citizen workers, the recruiters would go to halfway houses and methadone clinics and recruit people with substance abuse disorders and pay them in substances.
Oh my gosh.
So to use their substance addiction as a way of entrapping them and forcing them to keep working in substandard conditions and abusive conditions, but by paying them in drugs. Kept them physically, so they didn't have to lock them in because they were controlled by their addictions and that were manipulated by the employers. We also see there were 2 labor trafficking studies in agriculture that were funded by the National Institute of Justice. One that studied monolingual Spanish speakers in the San Diego area. And they found there that of those workers, at least 30% reported indicators of human trafficking, that during their time working in agriculture in California, that at least 30% of them had experienced some form of labor trafficking. There was another study that the same researcher did in North Carolina in agriculture and found similarly about 25% of the workers that they interviewed had reported trafficking experiences. Again, coming from that human rights approach, as I mentioned, really kind of looking at the systemic issues. What we know is that the U.S. industries, many U.S. industries are rooted in our enslaved histories, right? Especially agriculture and especially agriculture in the South. And that in post-Reconstruction, when we started adopting protections for workers, certain industries were excluded from those protections, including agriculture, domestic work, and sex work. These 3 industries were the industries in which racism was most rampant, which most relied on formerly enslaved people. So there was a decision made to exclude those categories of workers so that they could continue to be abused and exploited.
And marginalized, and exploited. Yep.
Exactly right. So what we see is that there is the minimum wage protections, the OSHA protections that are more extensive, certainly not sufficient in many industries, I would argue for sure. I'm sure some employers feel like the regulations are overwhelming, but in many industries, they're wholly insufficient but they're sort of non-existent. Agriculture is the only industry in which youth are allowed to be employed without protections, without the same protections in which the restrictions are in place in other industries, with the excuse that there are, family farms. But the reality is, we know the agriculture industry in the United States no longer relies on family farms. There are very few family farms left in the United States where really it's a family. There might be smaller farms, but primarily that's very rare. And so to exclude the entire category of young people from protections in agriculture based on this fallacy is a willful decision to allow young people to be exploited in this form of work. And also not having the wage and hour protections, failing to even our capacity to hold workplaces accountable. We don't really invest in investigators at the Department of Labor at the federal or state level to really hold employers accountable to make sure that their workplaces are safe.
To do the kind of audits and inspections and there's not enough bandwidth to really make it stick.
Exactly right. Okay. I mean, it's sort of similar to, right? Like we've underfunded the IRS for decades and now, sort of your chance of being audited are almost none. So we can only expect that there's plenty of money to be recovered if we would just audit more people. And in the same way, that's true in workplaces and in some industries more than others. And also, not just to pick on agriculture, although that one's an easy picker, but also domestic work. Like there's another place. People who work in individual homes are not protected by wage and hour protections or workplace conditions. And that's another place where we see a lot of trafficking because workers are isolated in people's homes. So again, there's like no oversight. There's no inspection. And quite literally, the employer can say, I can do whatever I want. Like there's no law that says I have to treat you well. And as we continue to be more and more reliant as a society on home workers, home healthcare workers, childcare workers in our homes, people who clean our homes, and keeping them completely excluded from workplace protections is sort of, again, a glaring invitation to those who would feel
entitled to or privileged to take advantage of somebody else with less power, less education, often just less influence in general.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. And then on top of it, my expertise is in working with immigrant survivors. And so sort of, I always think to it, then we layer on top of it, the immigration system, which we have a lot of folks in this country who do not have legal status and for whom there is no path to legal status. You can come to the United States for many different reasons and decide to stay here, work very hard, follow all the rules, file your taxes, be a good citizen, be a good community member, and still not have a path to legal status. There is no application you can apply for. I think a lot of times in the popular understanding, the thought is, oh, these folks are just not getting in line. They just haven't applied for legal status because they're lazy or not willing to pay the money or whatever. But the reality is there is no route. Really, the routes to legal status are having an employer sponsor you, having a family member sponsor you, or claiming asylum. Those are the three primary ways to get legal status in the United States. If you're someone who comes to the U.S. seeking economic opportunity,
you're out of luck. Yeah.
You're out of luck, Gwen.
Well, that is a great segue, Jean, into the kind of other topic I wanted to make sure we covered with you, given your expertise, which is I know that our visa system has, in your view, and this was news to me, I will admit, I had no idea that this was really a pathway, but actually creates some kind of perverse incentives, if you will, for trafficking. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I think you mentioned maybe it was the H-1 system. Is that?
Yeah. There are ways that employers can bring temporary workers into the United States. And there's the H visas, there's the J visas, there's L visas, and then there are sort of less popular visas. But the primary ones are the H2A, H2B, and the H1B, and then the J visas. But all of these are temporary work visas that do not lead to citizenship as a sort of automatic path. There are ways that you can sort of by hook or by crook get a work visa and then have your employer sponsor you in another way and do something else. And then eventually it's possible many years later.
A lot of hoops to jump through. Yeah.
A lot of hoops. And again, as I just said, if your employer files this, right? So again, as I mentioned before, it's about power, right? Who holds the power? So with our immigration system, with these work visas, the employer is the one who holds all the power. They have to file the first steps. They are the ones who have to file for the visa. And for most of these visas, then it is the employer who sort of effectively owns the visa.
Okay.
Right? The visa is put into the passport of the worker. The worker is allowed to enter the United States and work on that visa. But ultimately, it is the employer who owns that visa. And so the worker is allowed to work only for that one employer and only for the time period specified in the visa.
Okay.
If the work conditions change, so there are ways in which this becomes problematic. One is you've got an exploiter who is the employer, right? Like you've got somebody who's like, hey, this is a way I can bring in workers who have no power underpay them, treat them poorly, and then kick them out when I'm done and wipe my hands of them because they have no
legal recourse to fight or to stay. Yeah. Yeah.
At the end of their visa, they have to leave. Like that's the rule. That's the rule set forth by the US government. So when I tell that worker, you better do what I say or I'm going to cancel your visa, that's true. You better not report these conditions to anyone or I'll cancel your visa. That is also true. Right? If the worker says, well, this isn't fair. You're supposed to pay me a legal wage and you're not, I'm going to go work over there. Oh yeah. You leave here. The minute you step out of this job, your visa is canceled. I can call the immigration service and have them raid your new employer. I know where you live. I can send them after you and make a report. And in some jurisdictions, that will happen. That
happens. Yeah. Well, I've also heard of employers who will have kind of the opposite track, which it seems even worse to me, which is not hey, I'll use you up and spit you back out, but I'm going to run the period of your visa and then I will reincorporate with a new name that has one letter that's different and apply for a brand new visa and continue to abuse you. Is that also happening? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes they do that, right? So they create a new, again, oversight, right? There's not a whole lot of oversight over these programs.
Yeah.
They're getting better, at least in making data available. But yeah, we see abusive employers who are fined, who are even charged, who are disbarred from the system, just reincorporating and getting thousands of new visas. That's something I just talked to a reporter about the case that broke in Atlanta, Operation Blooming Onion, of that labor trafficking, persistent labor trafficking into the fields in Georgia and other southern states, where the reporter was like, I've just looked into the data that's available publicly, and it is clearly the same employers who just changed their name by a letter or incorporate a new corporation, and they've had thousands of workers every year. Even after violations are found, workplace violations are found, they are disbarred from the program. They just submit a new application with a slightly different name and get approved for another 5,000 visas. People known to the US government as abusing and exploiting their workers.
As bad actors are still able to do it over and over.
Continuing. And what we also know is that many employers who use these employment-based visa systems are good employers. And so folks in foreign countries have a very hard time knowing, is this a good employer or a bad employer?
Or bad.
Which one is it? I know that this program can, for many people, lead to a good U.S. wage in decent working conditions that will bring my family in the home country out of poverty in a way that staying here in my home country will never happen. So that is the dangling carrot, right? And so in order to try to get to that carrot, the workers in the home country generally have to pay a recruiter in the home country thousands of dollars to connect them to these jobs, to these possibilities. So then they arrive in the United States and they've either got a good employer who makes good on their promises, pays them as they're supposed to, and they get a decent amount of money that they can repay the recruiter back home and bring their family out of poverty. And then everyone else in their community says, I want one of those visas too.
Right. Yeah.
Or you're unlucky, you get one of those abusive employers who doesn't pay you, who doesn't give you good working conditions. Now you've got a debt back home that
you can't pay off. Yeah.
No possible way, because it's based on like US dollars. Like it's 2,000 US dollars, which in the US you can pay off if you work for 2 years for an employer who pays you a living wage. But, back in Honduras, back in Thailand, back in Malaysia, back in
Romania,
rural China.
Yeah.
You can't raise that much money. So now you're stuck in the US knowing that your family back home is depending on you, and you put up your family home as collateral. You took out loans with loan sharks or whatever you had to do because your cousin got a good job through that same recruiter and was able to bring his family out of poverty. And so you thought that was going to happen too. And now you're in the US and your only option to save your family is to find a way to get at least some of that money.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the US employer can keep promising, I'll pay you at the end of the year. I'll pay you next month. I'll pay you whenever. So the T visa gives a hope for that, but that's frankly not well known to these workers. Like they're not coming here, believing, hey, there's a T visa. And if I just sort of put up with enough, then I'll get that. They're really coming here believing that if they comply with the terms of the job, work really hard.
They work hard. Yeah. The American dream concept. Yeah.
Right. And yet the system is set up so that if an employer chooses to violate that promise, there's almost no repercussions. It is pervasive. Yeah. And the worker, before they know what's really happening, before they believe that this dream is not going to happen, because they are desperate to believe. And the employers generally do keep them strung along, right? They keep saying, you got to work for 3 months to pay off your travel fees. I had to do this. Times are bad right now. And then sometimes also, frankly, there is the case where an employer maybe believed that they needed 40 workers, brought 40 workers, and COVID happens. And now their business shuts down.
Now they suddenly only need 10 or 20. Yeah. Yeah.
Or none whatsoever because the business goes out of business. Now those workers, their debt does not go away to the recruiter.
But they have no work. Yeah.
They have no work and they have no ability to take the visa, and for the employer to even say, you're right, like I don't need this worker anymore. With my blessing, please go forth and find another job. That does not exist right now.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the reforms. It's called portability, to be able to say, hey, this situation is not working out. This isn't what the worker expected, or the employer's needs have changed during the term of the visa, but it's still a good visa. So go ahead. You were supposed to work on my painting crew, but I don't have any jobs anymore. So go find another job with another painting crew.
And be able to move your visa over there. That sounds like a very important reform. I'm surprised we don't have it yet, but I'm so glad to know that your organization, among others, are lobbying for those kind of changes. That's fantastic. We are at time, so I'm sorry. This has been such a great conversation. We could probably schedule another one and just keep talking for another half an hour. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us, Jean. And how can people find out more about the Freedom Network or contact you?
Yeah, you can go onto our website. So it's all written out, freedomnetworkusa.org, O-R-G. And there's lots of information there about trafficking, about our work, about our members, and how you can support our work, our advocacy work, our work to help survivors across the United States to get access to the services and support they need after they escape from their trafficking situation. So yeah, have a look.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining us, Jean.
Thank you.
Okay.